Tonight's video is filled with the kind of stories that don't hit you all at once. They begin quietly, almost harmlessly. A strange look, an awkward encounter, a sound you can explain away. But the longer they go on, the more wrong everything starts to feel. And that's what makes these stories so disturbing. Not the idea of monsters, not jump scares, not shadows in the dark, but ordinary moments slowly turning into something deeply unsettling. So if you're alone right now, maybe leave a light on, get comfortable, and let's get into 4 horror stories that only get worse the longer you listen. If you enjoy slow burn horror, real lifestyle stories, and dark, unsettling narrations, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which story got under your skin the most. Now, let's begin. A few years ago, I was doing general repair work for people who owned cabins, small rental properties and hunting spots out in remote areas. It was the kind of work I actually liked. No office, no coworkers, no one hovering over me. Just me, my tools, and whatever needed fixing. Most of the jobs were isolated, and that was part of the appeal. I liked being left alone. I liked the quiet. I liked driving out to places most people wouldn't want to be after dark, finishing the work, and heading home with that tired feeling that at least meant the day had been honest. One particular job took me about an hour and a half outside the town I was living in at the time. The property was a hunting cabin buried deep in a wooded area. The owner only used it during certain months, so it had been sitting empty for a while. There was roof damage, a broken frame around one of the windows, and some electrical issues on the back side of the cabin. Nothing major on its own, but enough to keep me busy all day. By the time I packed up, the sun was already starting to drop. I remember standing there for a moment beside my truck, thinking about whether I should just spend the night in the cabin and leave in the morning. Technically, I could have. It wasn't comfortable, but it was usable. Still, I had work lined up the next day, and I didn't feel like waking up in the middle of nowhere. So I loaded my tools, got in the truck, and started driving back. The road out wasn't really a road. It was more like a narrow dirt trail carved between dense trees. In some sections, it was so tight that if another vehicle came the other way, one of you would have to reverse until you found a wider patch. And because the trees pressed in so close on both sides, even that wasn't always easy. At first, the drive felt completely normal. I had the radio on low. I was sore from the day's work, but in a satisfying way. I was already thinking ahead to getting home, showering, and eating something that didn't come from a gas station. Then, maybe 20 minutes into the drive, I saw headlights ahead of me. That alone felt strange. I hadn't seen a single vehicle all day, not on the way in, not while I was working, not even at a distance. So when I saw those lights cutting through the trees, I instinctively slowed down. The other vehicles slowed too. A few seconds later, both of us had stopped, facing each other on that narrow road, maybe 20 or 30 feet apart. At that point, I still thought this was a normal inconvenience. I'd passed a slightly wider clearing a minute or so behind me, so I rolled my window down a little and raised my hand, trying to signal that I'd back up and let them through. But before I could even shift into reverse, both doors of the other car opened. 2 men stepped out. And immediately, something felt off. It's hard to explain exactly what it was at first. Sometimes your brain notices something before it gives you the words for it. The first thing I really registered was what they were wearing. not work clothes, not hiking gear, not anything that made sense for that area. Their clothes were loose, hanging strangely, almost robe-like under long outer layers. Not costumes exactly, but not normal either. There was something theatrical about them, and for a second, the only comparison that flashed into my mind was the kind of clothing you see in low-budget documentaries about cults or isolated religious groups. Neither of them said a word as they started walking toward my truck. I remember sitting there with both hands still on the wheel, trying to convince myself there had to be some ordinary explanation. Maybe they needed help. Maybe they were lost. Maybe something had happened further down the road. But the closer they got, the less that felt true. They weren't confused. They weren't hesitant. They were walking toward me like they already knew exactly what they were doing. One of them came up to my window. The other stayed just behind him, slightly to the side. As soon as they got close enough, I caught the smell. Alcohol, definitely. But underneath that, there was something else. Something sour and heavy. Damp earth, sweat, something metallic. Something I couldn't place, and honestly didn't want to. The one nearest my window leaned down slightly and asked, very flatly, "What are you doing out here?" Not aggressively, not politely, just flat. Like he already knew the answer and wanted to hear what I would say. I told him the truth. I said I'd been doing repair work on a cabin farther down the road and I was just heading home. He stared at me after I said that. No nod, no response, just staring. The other guy shifted his weight from foot to foot and kept glancing around like he couldn't stay still. He looked like he was either drunk, high, or wound up so tightly that anything could set him off. I said, "I can back up and let you pass." That's when everything changed. The man at my window suddenly grabbed the edge of the glass and slammed it inward. The cracking sound was so sharp and sudden that for half a second, I didn't even understand what had happened. The window didn't completely shatter, but it broke enough that glass dropped inside the door and onto the seat beside me. I froze. Before I could react, the second man stepped forward, and I saw the gun in his hand. It wasn't pointed directly at me yet. It didn't need to be. He said, "Get out." People always imagine they know how they'd respond in that kind of situation. They think they'd hit the gas. They think they'd fight. They think adrenaline would make them brave. But real fear doesn't always make you bold. Sometimes it makes you painfully, completely aware of how fragile you are. I opened the truck door and stepped out. The air felt colder than it had a second earlier. Maybe it actually was. Maybe it was just the adrenaline finally catching up. My hands were already shaking. I asked them what they wanted. The first man smiled. Not a friendly smile, not an amused one. Just a thin, wrong-looking smile that made it hard to tell what he was feeling, if he was feeling anything at all. Then he asked me, "Do you want to come to a party?" For a second, I honestly thought I'd heard him wrong. Nothing about the situation matched the question. I said, "No, I'm just trying to get home." He tilted his head slightly, like he was considering me, and then he asked if I wanted something to eat. He said it was meat, said it tasted incredible, said it was unlike anything I'd ever had before. There was something in the way he said it that turned my stomach immediately. It wasn't a joke. That was the part I'll never forget. He sounded sincere, like he was offering me something he genuinely believed I'd be excited about. Behind him, the other man gave a low laugh. The sound of it was ugly, loose, wrong, like he was only halfway connected to what was happening. I told them I wasn't interested and that they needed to back off. The one holding the gun adjusted his grip. The first man stepped closer. Now I could see his face clearly. Sweat on his skin, bloodshot eyes, and some kind of dark smear on his sleeve that I refused to look at too closely. When I told them again to leave me alone, the second man moved suddenly, like he was about to hit me. And that's the moment I still think about, because I don't know if this is what saved me, or if I just got lucky. I blurted out the first thing that came into my head. I told them my location was being tracked. I said my sister could see exactly where I was on GPS, and if I stopped moving for too long, she would call the police. None of that was true. Not that day. We'd used location sharing before on long drives, but not that night. I was lying, completely. But the second I said it, both of them paused. The one who had started moving toward me stopped. The one with the gun looked at him, then back at me. There was this awful little silence. The forest around us felt dead still. No wind, no birds, no sound except my own breathing. So I pushed the lie harder. I said my phone was live. I said someone knew exactly where I was and exactly how long I'd been stopped. Neither one of them spoke. Then, without a word, they started backing away. Slowly, carefully, as if something in the situation had shifted just enough to make me not worth the risk. They got back into their car. The doors shut. The headlights dipped as they reversed down the road, and then they were gone. I stood there for a few seconds after that, unable to move, just staring into the dark where their lights had disappeared. When I finally got back in my truck, my hands were shaking so badly that it took me 2 tries to get the key in. I didn't stop driving until I hit a real road with actual traffic. The second I had service again, I called the police. I gave them everything I could remember: the men, the car, the clothes, the road, the time, the smell, the gun. Nothing came of it. No one matched the description. No one found the vehicle. No follow-up ever gave me anything useful. And maybe what bothers me most is that they didn't feel random. They didn't feel like 2 drunks messing with the wrong person. It felt like I had driven into the edge of something, like I had stumbled too close to some place or some act or some night that I was never supposed to witness. I still drive lonely roads for work sometimes, but now, if I ever see headlights ahead of me in the middle of nowhere, I don't assume it's just another driver. I moved into that house because I thought quiet would fix me. That sounds dramatic, but it's true. At the time, my life felt stalled. I was working in a small clothing shop during the day and trying to build an online store on the side at night. Custom pieces, thrift flips, little things I kept telling myself would eventually become something bigger. I wasn't doing badly, exactly. I just wasn't moving. So when I found a cheap rental in a semi-rural area outside town, it felt like the kind of reset I needed. The house itself wasn't special. Single story, small front yard, a backyard that backed into trees. A few other houses nearby, but all spread out enough that you still felt mostly alone. That was what I liked about it. At first, it was peaceful. I'd go to work, come home, make something to eat, open my laptop, and spend my evenings trying to turn my little online business idea into something real. It wasn't glamorous, but it was calm. and for a while, calm felt like enough. The house next to mine looked empty when I first moved in, or at least I thought it was empty. Then, a couple of weeks later, I noticed a trailer parked on the property, and after that, I started seeing someone there. A man. The first time I really saw him, he was standing near the edge of his yard, looking in my direction. Not waving, not doing yard work, not smoking, texting, pacing, or anything normal. Just standing there, looking. At the time, I told myself not to be weird about it. New place, new neighbor, different environment. Your brain fills in blanks when you're uncomfortable. That's all I thought it was. But then, I saw him again. And again. Sometimes he'd just be standing still. Sometimes he'd move slowly around his yard with this strange, detached posture, like he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do with his own body. He never seemed relaxed, never natural. Even from a distance, he looked wrong somehow. The first time he stepped into my backyard, I didn't hear him approach. That's the part that really stayed with me. I was outside hanging clothes to dry when I felt that strange sense you get when someone is behind you. I turned around, and he was already there. A few steps into my yard, silent, staring down at the ground like he was inspecting something. I asked, as calmly as I could, "Do you need something?" He didn't answer right away. He tilted his head slightly, like he was processing what I said, and then he responded with something that didn't fit the question at all. I can't remember his exact words now, but it was something about keeping things clean, something about watching how things grow. It sounded less like a reply and more like he had resumed a conversation that had never actually happened. I told him more firmly this time that it was my yard and I wanted him to stay on his side. He nodded once and walked away. But even that felt wrong. He didn't apologize, didn't look embarrassed, didn't really seem to register me as a person. It was more like I had interrupted a thought he was having, and he had decided to leave because of that, not because I mattered. After that, it kept happening. Not every day, but enough. Sometimes I'd catch movement near the fence line and see him standing there. Sometimes he'd already be in the yard by the time I noticed him. Every time I said something, he would leave. Every time, he'd mutter some unsettling, disconnected sentence on the way out. Nothing directly threatening. That was what made it so difficult. If he had yelled at me, tried to touch me, or openly threatened me, I would have called the police immediately. But he didn't. He just kept crossing lines in ways that were small enough to second guess and strange enough to get under my skin. I kept telling myself that if it got worse, then I'd do something. Then, one afternoon, he came to my front door. I was working on my laptop when I heard a few light knocks. When I opened the door, he was standing closer to me than he'd ever been before. Up close, I noticed details I hadn't seen at a distance. His clothes were worn in a way that didn't look like ordinary wear, more like he used them for things they weren't meant for. His expression was almost blank, but his eyes had this focused, intent quality that made me want to shut the door immediately. Instead, I froze and waited for him to speak. He asked if I wanted someone to clean my backyard. For just a second, that almost felt normal. It was the first thing he'd ever said that sounded remotely like a regular conversation. But the relief didn't last, because it was still him. I told him no, that everything was fine. He stood there a little too long after that, like he was waiting for something else, some invitation, some signal. Then he nodded and left. That night, I checked all the doors twice. A week passed. Then, one night, everything changed. I had already gotten ready for bed. The house was mostly dark. I was sitting at the edge of the bed doing that final mental check people do before sleeping. Front door locked, back door locked, lights off, phone charging. Something in me said, check the house one more time. So I opened my bedroom door. And there he was, standing in the hallway just outside my room, close enough that if I had stepped forward without looking, I would have walked right into him. For a second, it didn't even register. It felt unreal, like I was looking at the wrong image in the wrong place. Then my brain caught up, and I saw what he was wearing. He had on one of my tops, a shirt I'd worn earlier that week and left near the laundry area. It was stretched awkwardly across him, fitting all wrong, and for some reason, that detail hit harder than the fact that he was standing inside my house. Because breaking in was terrifying, but that was intimate in a way that felt deeply violating. His face looked different up close in the dark. Not angry, not wild. If anything, he looked focused, intent, as if he had been waiting for that exact moment. Then he took a step toward me. That snapped me out of it. I slammed the bedroom door shut and locked it, barely getting the latch in place. I started screaming even though I knew there was a good chance no one would hear me. I grabbed my phone and called the police, trying to explain what was happening while staring at the door, waiting for the handle to move. But nothing happened. No footsteps, no pounding, no whispering, nothing. Just silence. And that silence was somehow worse. It made it feel like he was still there, standing on the other side, waiting without making a sound. When the police arrived, I stayed in the room until they told me it was safe. By the time I opened the door, the hallway was empty. They searched the house. They took my statement. They found signs of entry near a back window and evidence that someone had been inside longer than I realized. A few hours later, they found him in the trailer next door. Apparently, he had gone back there and acted like nothing had happened. I moved out almost immediately after that. Not because I thought he'd come back, but because, after something like that, the house stops being a house. It becomes a place where a version of your life ended. And even now, years later, if I leave laundry out anywhere for too long, I feel sick. I was in my early 20s and still living with my parents when this happened. We lived in a rural area where almost nothing ever happened. That was part of the reason it felt safe. Life out there was predictable, quiet. The kind of place where unusual things stood out immediately because they simply didn't happen often. One afternoon, I was home alone. It was still light outside, not even evening yet. I had just gotten back from work, changed into comfortable clothes, and gone into the kitchen to make something small to eat, when someone knocked on the front door. That wasn't especially strange. Every now and then, neighbors stopped by. Sometimes people got lost and asked for directions because roads in our area weren't marked very well. So I opened the door without thinking much about it. 2 men were standing there. I didn't recognize either of them. At first glance, nothing about them was openly alarming. They weren't dressed badly, they weren't aggressive, but something about them felt out of place. Maybe it was the way they stood, too still, too deliberate. Maybe it was just instinct. One of them asked if I knew where a certain farm was. He gave a name, but I didn't recognize it. I told him no, I didn't know of any farm by that name around there. That should have been the end of it, and technically it was. They nodded, said something brief like, "All right," and turned to leave. But right before they did, both of them looked past me into the house. Not casually, deliberately. The kind of look that isn't curiosity, it's assessment. I felt it immediately, not as a full-blown fear, just a small shift in my stomach, a tiny internal warning. Still, I brushed it off. I closed the door, locked it, and went back inside. Later that night, when my parents got home, I mentioned the two men. I didn't make a big deal out of it. My dad asked what they looked like, but the conversation stayed casual. I think all of us assumed it was nothing. A few nights later, my dad told us that while he had been outside near the driveway late in the evening, he noticed a car parked near the road. That was unusual. When he called out, the car started immediately and drove off. He didn't chase it or report it, but I remember the way he told the story, calm on the surface, with just enough tension underneath to make it clear he didn't like it. That was the first time I thought seriously about those two men again, but still, I didn't connect everything. Not really. About a week after that, I was home alone again. The day was gray and overcast, the kind of afternoon that makes a house feel dim even when it isn't dark yet. I was in my room, lying on my bed, when I heard a heavy, dull sound from the back of the house. At first, I thought it was something outside. Then I heard it again. A thud. Then pressure, like something hitting wood. I got up and stepped into the hallway. The sound came again, louder this time, from the direction of the back door. I stopped halfway down the hall and listened. There was another impact. Then a crack. A very clear, unmistakable splitting sound. And in that moment, before I even saw anything, I knew someone was trying to get in. The back door gave way. It swung inward slightly, broken at the frame. And standing there were the same two men. I recognized them instantly. That made everything worse. Because then, it wasn't random anymore. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't someone at the wrong house. It wasn't a misunderstanding. They had been there before. They had seen me. And now, they were back. I turned to run, but I didn't get far. One of them grabbed me from behind. I still remember how his clothes smelled. Stale, damp, unwashed. It's strange what your mind latches onto in moments like that. Not the most important detail, just the one that burns itself into you forever. They were trying to drag me toward the back of the house. And the worst part was how controlled they seemed. This wasn't chaotic. This wasn't impulsive. It felt planned. Then one of them said something that I still hear in my head sometimes. He said, "Let's do it here." The other one immediately answered, tense and urgent, "No, let's take her." They started arguing, actually arguing, right there, while they still had hold of me. The shift was so abrupt that for a second, I couldn't even process it. They were pulling in slightly different directions now, no longer coordinated. One of them was angry. The other one was getting louder. The control they'd had when they came in started to crack. Then they shoved each other. It wasn't a long fight. It lasted seconds, but seconds can be enough. Their grip loosened. I pulled away. I stumbled hard, nearly falling, then ran. I got to my phone and called the police, then my parents. By the time I looked back toward the hallway, they were gone. They had fled the same way they entered. The house was silent again, except for my breathing and the ringing in my ears. When the police arrived, there wasn't much left besides the broken door and the mess they had made forcing their way in. I gave my statement, so did my parents. Later, we were told that investigators believed the first visit had likely been intentional, that the men may have been watching the house, checking who lived there, seeing when people were home and when they weren't. That first knock at the door, it probably wasn't about directions at all. It was reconnaissance. That realization affected me more than the break-in itself, because it meant the danger had started long before I knew I was in danger. After that, everything changed. We added lights, reinforced the doors, installed cameras, changed locks. None of it fixed the feeling. I started checking windows constantly. I hated being home alone. Unexpected knocks at the door made my chest tighten. Even now, years later, if someone I don't know asks for directions at my door, I don't open it all the way. This last story didn't happen to me. It happened to my cousin. I'm changing her name here, so I'll call her Hira. At the time, Hira was renting a cheap apartment in an old building because it was what she could afford. The location was decent, and she figured the place itself didn't matter much since she was only planning to stay for a year or so. From the beginning, though, the building felt wrong. Not haunted, not dramatic, just wrong. The hallways were too quiet. The stairwell always smelled faintly damp, like old concrete and wet walls. The elevator worked when it felt like it. Most of the lights in the corridor were dim enough that you noticed shadows before you noticed detail. Her apartment was on the second floor, and directly above her was a unit the landlord told her was vacant. That mattered later. For the first week or two, everything was fine. Then she started hearing sounds from above. At first, it was easy to dismiss. A drag across the floor, a few slow footsteps, a soft impact now and then. Old buildings make noise. But the sounds became more specific. Late at night, usually between 2 and 3 in the morning, she'd hear pacing directly over her bedroom. Back and forth, back and forth. Not random creaks, footsteps, measured ones. Then, one night, she heard 3 heavy knocks from above. Not pounding, not banging, just 3 deliberate thuds. Then, silence. A little later, it happened again. 3 knocks. She finally assumed the landlord had lied about the apartment being empty. A day or two after that, she saw someone standing at the far end of the 3rd floor hallway. Just standing there. She was coming up the stairs when she looked up and saw the figure near the dark corner by the supposedly vacant unit. Too far away to make out clearly, but definitely someone. She looked down long enough to grab her phone and text the landlord, "Is someone staying in the unit above me?" The response came back quickly. "No, that apartment is empty." When she looked up again, the hallway was empty. That should have been the point where she trusted herself. Instead, like most people, she chose the explanation that required the least fear. Maybe she'd seen another tenant. Maybe the lighting had tricked her. Maybe she was tired. Then one night, while the footsteps were going overhead again, she got irritated enough to grab a broomstick and tap the ceiling twice. Just 2 quick knocks, like a passive-aggressive way of saying, "I can hear you." The response came immediately. 3 knocks, directly above her. She went cold. The next day, she confronted the landlord in person and insisted he come upstairs with her. He acted annoyed, but he did it. They went to the third floor together. The door to the empty unit was shut, locked. Dust had settled around the frame. The landlord gestured at it like that proved everything. "See?" he said. Maybe that should have been reassuring, but Hira noticed something he didn't. The dust near the bottom edge of the door wasn't even. One side had a faintly disturbed streak, like something had moved there recently, or like the door had shifted more than it should have. She didn't say anything. She just went back downstairs. A couple of days later, she came home and found a folded piece of paper on the floor outside her apartment door. No envelope, no name, just folded paper. Inside, there was only one sentence: "Answer at night." That was the moment she stopped thinking she might be imagining things. That night, she checked every lock, put a chair under the front doorknob, left her bedroom light on. She barely slept. Around 2:40 in the morning, she woke up to a soft scraping sound above her. Not footsteps this time, something slower, something lower, like someone crawling. The sound moved across the ceiling directly above her bed, then drifted toward the corner of the room and stopped. A few seconds later, she heard a light tapping at her bedroom window. 2 taps. She froze. Her apartment was on the second floor. There was no balcony outside that window, no ledge a person could stand on. Then the tapping came again. After that, she heard a long, slow scratch against the glass. Not hard, not frantic, just deliberate. By morning, she was shaking from exhaustion. The next day, she had a friend come over. Together, they went outside to look at the bedroom window from the street. There was nowhere anyone could have stood. No balcony, no fire escape, no accessible ledge. That evening, she decided she was staying somewhere else for the night. While packing, she opened the top shelf of her wardrobe to grab a bag and found an old phone sitting in the back. It wasn't hers. The screen was cracked. The battery was dead. But there was a SIM card inside. That alone was terrifying, because it meant someone had been in her apartment long enough to leave something behind. Her friend convinced her to charge it before calling the police, just in case it contained anything useful. When the phone powered on, they opened the gallery. It was full of photos taken inside her apartment, her kitchen, her hallway, her couch. And then, a photo taken from outside her bedroom door while she was asleep in bed. After that, the police were called immediately. This time, the landlord stopped acting annoyed. Police searched the building, including the vacant unit upstairs. Inside, they found evidence that someone had been staying there temporarily. An old mattress, water bottles, canned food, wrappers, and signs that parts of the ceiling access and ventilation space had been tampered with. Whoever it was had likely been living above her, watching her, possibly moving through maintenance spaces to observe parts of her apartment without being seen. The phone, they believed, either belonged to him or had been left intentionally. The worst part? They found the setup, but they never found the person. Hira never slept there again. She went back once in daylight with other people, just long enough to grab documents, clothes, and a few valuables. She left the rest. And to this day, whenever someone says they found a cheap apartment in an old building and it seems good enough for now, she always says the same thing. In old buildings, it's never just the walls that have a history.